Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative webinar, Trump's Tariffs and the Death of Free Trade, examining the impacts of Trump's economic warfare on Canada and Mexico, and how the federal and provincial governments can and should respond in the short and long term. We'll be hearing from four researchers who'll be putting the tariffs and Canada's response into historic perspective and consider how we could profit from this moment to transform the Canadian economy. I'm Amanda Klang, Senior Communication Specialist with the CCPA National Office and your host for today's webinar. I'm speaking to you from Tiohtià:ke, the Mohawk name for the island of Montreal. This is the western edge of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is one of the longest lasting participatory democracies in the world. We recognize these unceded territories here and across Turtle Island and the many settlers and Indigenous people upon it. We look to a future that's better than the present, and this is what guides our work today. But we also know that there's much work to be done. First, a little housekeeping. We're so pleased to have so many of you joining us here today. So give us a shout in the chat where you're from, where you're coming from. And just know that you can ask questions via the Q&A module, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end of the webinar. Okay. Since January 20th, Canada has been at economic war with its largest trading partner and closest international ally. U.S. President Donald Trump has now paused his proposed 25% tariff on most imports from Canada and Mexico for 30 days. But the threat of these tariffs will continue to loom for weeks and likely months to come. And even if Trump's tariffs were rescinded tomorrow, everything in our relationship with the U.S. has changed. Canada can no longer trust the United States to act as an honest partner. So I want to start this conversation by turning to my CCPA colleague, Stuart True, who's a senior researcher based in Ottawa and the director of the CCPA's Trade and Investment Research Project. In the last few weeks, Stu has had media requests coming out his ears, almost all of them focused on the Trump tariff threat, and he's going to bring us up to date. Stu, you've been covering the twists and turns of this saga. Thanks to you, I learned the expression ragging the puck, which I didn't know, meaning to stall, postpone, and otherwise cause a delay. So, Stu, where are we right now with Trump's tariff threat?
Oh, thanks, Amanda. Well, I'm assuming that many on this call probably know as much about what's going on as I do. I mean, this has been the only thing in the news for a few days, if not more, or it seems that way at least, right? So we're kind of overwhelmed with information about the tariff threat. We're inundated with Trump. And like you, I'm trying to keep up with these events as best as I can, but it's not easy, right? So Trump is moving very fast, obviously, as he tries to centralize US power in his hands and in the hands of his lackeys like Elon Musk. The chaos and the constant attention, I think, the attention to what Trump is doing and saying, I think this is part of the new Republican strategy. The noise, right, which overwhelms our ability to think about these changes and to organize responses. So I do know that this time has been stressful for people, many people, obviously people in the United States, in Canada and Mexico and around much of the world. And we're watching the news closely for hints about how this will affect us and everyone else, our neighbors, and how to respond. So let me just start by saying that, like, I feel you. I've been extremely stressed and worried about this moment. I've been worried about the future of our country, and I've been worried about our sisters and brothers in Mexico and the United States. So sending solidarity their way as well. So what was the threat? What was the response, the outcome? Where's this going? Amanda, you said a little bit about this already. The threat, the plan was obviously to use tariffs to achieve U.S. objectives. You know, tariffs are, according to Trump, the most beautiful word in the English dictionary, right? He plans to use them to achieve U.S. objectives against friends and enemies alike, as we're coming to learn very quickly. So in November, Trump proposed these 25% tariffs on all Canadian and Mexican goods. This was tied, to some kind of thing he wanted, demands he wanted related to fentanyl, right? This highly dangerous, highly toxic, fatal ingredient that is being put into opioids and other illicit drugs in around the world, but in particular in the United States and Canada. This loomed over both countries for several weeks before the inauguration. Both countries vowing to respond if tariffs were hit, but at the same time making kind of conciliatory moves towards Trump with respect to the border. We saw things like Wab Canoe in Manitoba sending conservation officers to the border to act as immigration police as well. And the Canadian government, leasing these Black Hawk helicopters to do something, right? To go fly around and make videos that we can then send to Trump and have him watch to make sure we're being good neighbors. And we all thought that tariffs would be put in place on Inauguration Day, which is what he promised on January 20th. But of course, they weren't. And then he said, we're going to delay them to February 1st. And again, he said, there's these issues around border safety, around migration. And he said he would definitively be putting them in place, right? 25% on everything, including 10% on Canadian oil and gas. So this is where we got the saying, right? Ragging the puck, right? Amanda, this idea that he's not really shooting. He's not trying to score on anyone. He's just dragging this out again and again. I'm going to put tariffs on you, but then he never actually does, right? So, you started to suspect that maybe something along those lines was happening. I think Canada and Mexico put up a fairly strong show of resistance. The Trudeau government announced it would apply counter tariffs, right, applying to $160 billion worth of imports. That's about a third of what we import in a given year from the United States. While provincial governments said they would take U.S. booze off of the shelves and cancel U.S. contracts, like Elon Musk's Starlink deal with Ontario, Mexico was going further, and Mexico has been putting in place quite an amazing industrial strategy, right, to really reshore production in that country, but to do it from a North American perspective. Very interesting stuff that maybe we can talk about later. Anyway, an agreement was reached yesterday, as we know, apparently whereby Mexico and Canada will send troops to the border, appoint a fentanyl czar, and agree to a joint task force of some kind on organized crime and the illicit opiate trade. And Canada and Mexico will declare Mexican cartels as a terrorist organization. So we're going to have to keep an eye on all of these things, because I think some of them will have significant consequences potentially for human rights, for Canada's approach to drug policy, for migration, and perhaps for Canadian sovereignty, right, depending on what this joint task force looks like. Amanda, you can stop me at any time. I was going to keep going and maybe look at whether we've avoided the tariffs at this point. But if you want to move on to someone else, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know.
Thanks, Stu. I had a question that I don't think you've addressed yet, which is in all the confusion and just, the barrage of what's it called? Like executive orders from Trump and everything, like he's going in a million directions. What, in terms of Canada and Mexico and these tariffs, what do you sense that he's after, in fact? Do we know? I mean, we don't know, but what do you speculate?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. Fentanyl was one of several, what I would say are phony justifications for Trump's tariff order, for his decision to wage economic warfare on America's neighbors. The U.S. economy does depend on Mexico and Canada in many ways. They are obviously less trade dependent overall than Canada, but they do depend on us. Yet Trump keeps talking about the trade deficit with Canada as being a problem. He continues to say, the U.S. is subsidizing Canada's economic success to the tune of something like $200 billion. Also a lie. He continues to say we're not spending enough on military equipment and that we should become the 51st state, right? There's some of these overt threats of annexing all over parts of our territory. And, so it's hard to know exactly what is going on to this, what the ultimate strategy is. There's a lot of theories out there, from this being just his style, right? The art of the deal, wants to kind of make a show of force and then be seen to be getting concessions from his friends and his enemies. Some people say it's part of a grand strategy related to maybe the value of the dollar, um, some kind of reforming of global trade patterns, right? It could be about, it is about onshoring manufacturing, I would say, bringing investment to the United States. I don't think we can definitively say, though, that there is a core goal or strategy. I think pinning him down is difficult, I should say. And we've got to acknowledge that there are differences of opinion within his own team and within the Republican Party about what trade policy is for. But I do think the use of tariffs is here to stay, right? The use of tariffs as a coercive means of getting what the United States wants, I think is here to stay. And we've seen a real kind of coming to terms with that concept from the markets, quote unquote, from big bankers like Jamie Dimon, who's coming out now and telling Americans they're not such a big deal. Obviously, they're also supported by many labor unions in the United States as a way to protect jobs. So, this is where the title of this webinar comes from, I think, though, because when you take that position, tariffs are good. Tariffs are something we're going to use to reshape the global order, to coerce other countries into getting things we want. You're really talking about the death of the free trade idea in North America, and I think beyond that. The old neoliberal delusions, right? About a shared prosperity through the unregulated flow of goods and services and investment. I think those days are done. And we have to prepare for that, Amanda.
Right. Okay, Stu, that's great. Very helpful overview. And you've got so much knowledge that'll be great to have you weigh in the rest of our webinar, including questions at the end. But I think now I would like to turn to another of our panelists today, and that is Caroline Brouillette. She's Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. Hi, Caroline, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm very good. Thanks so much for having me.
Caroline, the Climate Action Network just put out a statement that calls for a response that puts people first and builds resilience. So response to all these, what we're discussing. Can you explain a little bit more about that statement, what it's about?
Happy to. And maybe just before I go, I want to say thanks so much for inviting me. A pleasure to join so much smart folk whom I will very much be learning from and using their smart thoughts to help make sense of the situation, which we're still analyzing. And just I'm joining from Brazil here, where the whole Climate Action Network is joining together. So interesting parallels to be made and discussions that are happening here as I'm joining you. But as you said, Amanda, Climate Action Network Canada on Friday with our members put out a statement calling on the Canadian government to, in its response, really center people and a long-term response to this crisis. I think since COVID, we've really, I think, as a movement and as humans on this planet, seen that the crises that we are collectively facing are increasingly interconnected, whether that's the linkages between, biodiversity and global pandemics, or geopolitics and fossil fuel expansion, as we've seen in Ukraine and as we're really seeing now. And I think the main message we wanted to put out there with this response is that, first of all, our dependence as a country of our economy on the U.S. is intrinsically linked to our dependence on fossil fuels, oil and gas, which are responsible at the root cause for the climate crisis. But that also means that in our response, we can tackle those two things jointly in a way that not only in the shorter term makes us less vulnerable in the face of threats from unpredictable belligerent global leaders, but as well position the Canadian economy for success, creating sustainable jobs and protecting people in the longer term. And so our statement puts forward 4 key recommendations. First of all, rebuilding the social safety net and preparing for the potential rise in unemployment, a little bit like we saw during COVID. The social safety net expansion could also help build a bridge for workers to sustainable jobs, including for young people. And I want to say that despite the fact that we averted, at least for now, as Stuart was saying, the tariffs, these recommendations very much still stand in the idea of making us less vulnerable to these threats that are going to continue coming again, because we are in the face of such an unpredictable leader down south. The second one was an idea put forward by the CCPA, so very grateful for the thought leadership, exerting pressure with strategic export taxes, and specifically on oil and gas, of which the U.S. is highly dependent from in terms of their imports. And it was said by Stuart, actually, it was calculated that this could help significantly with raising revenue to spend in this social safety net expansion, for instance. The third piece in the longer term is building a green industrial strategy that moves us away again from that continental energy security framework where we've tied our economy very closely, especially when it comes to our energy exports to the US market. So disentangling that, but also using it as an opportunity to disentangle our economy from highly volatile resources that we know lock us in the long term, not only in terms of climate devastation, but into sectors that the world is very much moving away from when we look at global trends. And then finally, this is a moment, despite the tension with our biggest trading partner, when we need to see more, not less, international cooperation, not only with Mexico, Colombia, the EU countries where we've seen similar threats exerted by Trump, but also just internationally, building these plurilateral coalitions that we need to balance what is currently at least one of the two most powerful countries in the world. I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks for summing that up. There are positive notes, this international cooperation, but we know that Trump's focus, or what he's stated anyways, is for greater energy deregulation, drilling in the Arctic, more fracking, more fossil fuel extraction. So what does this all mean for climate policy in Canada?
I think there's what we're currently seeing, and what a bold vision and an inclusive one could look like. And so very unfortunately, we're seeing this Canadian reflex to cave to the United States. And partially that's a reflection of the fact that the lobbyists of the industries of doom were very well prepared. When there's a crisis, they're already ready to seize it. And so that's what we saw, for instance, with the dilution of Canada's ambition when it comes to its 2035 climate target that was published late in 2024. It really felt like Prime Minister Trudeau just caved to US pressure, despite the fact that we should be doing the opposite and positioning the Canadian economy as one where we will be ready to welcome the investments that leave the United States, as some investments, for instance, from the Inflation Reduction Act are being pulled behind. We're also seeing interesting reactions from provinces. Unfortunately, places like Quebec have also said as a reaction that they might have to review the ambition of their climate plans. We've obviously seen Alberta look at its short-term interest and break away from the Team Canada approach. Interestingly, we've seen Doug Ford position himself as the defender of investments in clean energy jobs, especially with Ontario's dependence on EV and the automobile industry. So always good to watch the provinces, especially as we're entering a phase where politically we're seeing less leadership when it comes to climate policy, unfortunately. And then I would add lastly that Canada, we're on the West Coast in particular, has some carbon bombs in the making, in the form of liquefied natural gas project, LNG projects, and so we're seeing again industry and government utilize this crisis to resuscitate the specter of pipelines, including ones that we thought were long dead. So it's been unfortunate to see this lack of vision and imagination from many leaders. But again, there is an opportunity here to disentangle our economy, both from our dependence on US exports to the US and also our dependence on very volatile commodities that we know are not where the future is when it comes to the global transformation that we're seeing, and where affordability and safety is for Canadians and people across the world.
Thanks, Caroline. If people have questions for Caroline, you're welcome to put it in the chat. And I wanted to bring in our other panelists briefly to respond. So the two we haven't met so far are Richard Nimijean, Carleton University political scientist, who is in Ottawa, and CCPA senior economist Marc Lee, who is in Vancouver. And it looks like I get to control this now. So let's see if I can do this. The question I want to ask everybody is, how can we salvage hope for effective climate change in the new dynamic, the new situation that Caroline was explaining? And I think I can bring everybody in. Again, I do this. Hang on, I think I'm gonna do it like this. So I'm going to bring in Mark, am I going to be able to do this? Oh, there's Mark. Can I get it? Okay, two of us are here. And so I'll just repeat that question. I don't know if you have anything you can add. Salvaging hope for a new climate policy or a climate policy for Canada in this dynamic. I'm going to see if I can add Richard.
Yeah, well, can I go off of that?
Yep.
I mean, I think I would reinforce the points that Caro was making, that in this moment right now, we need to show strength against Trump, his bullying, and the type of response that we need to bring to bear should really be challenging sources of American economic power. Hadrian Mertens Kirkwood and I put out a piece yesterday listing some of the things that could be on a menu for a more proactive response. So one of the challenges of retaliatory tariffs is that they end up costing Canadians, households, and businesses, and that deepens the underlying recessionary pressures. However, there are a lot of American economic interests in Canada, $1.3 trillion in assets held by American corporations in Canada, and American corporations made $90 billion in profits in Canada in 2022. So I think there's a lot of additional things we could do to put more economic pressure on the menu that's not just about responding with tariffs. But I think it's also important that we not lose sight of the bigger picture, that at the end of the day, we need to build a Canada that is more green and sustainable, that is more affordable and fair, and that I think ultimately is more independent. And recognizing that this multi-decade economic integration project with the United States that the business community and our political leaders have pushed down our throats all of this time has ended up in abject failure, and that it's led to a situation where our dependence makes us extremely vulnerable to the measures that President Trump is now bringing forward. So there's a lot that we can do as Canadians, and I think beyond the very short-term response, we need to think longer term in terms of how we want to position our country and what we can do as Canadians to make this a better place.
Thanks for that, Marc. I think I'm going to move forward to Richard Nimijean and invite you, Richard, to speak about your area of expertise, which is the U.S.-Canada relationship, and particularly looking at how the promise of our trade relationship was going to guarantee Canada's prosperity. You wrote a whole chapter about this in the book, The Trudeau Record, which was edited by CCPA. So tell us a bit about the history of how we got into this dependent relationship with the U.S. and now in this crisis moment in the relationship.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I mean, we all know we've had a deeply entrenched relationship with the United States for decades, sort of bipartisan in nature, promoted by conservative governments and liberal governments. In the chapter that you referenced, you can see the book behind Stuart there. I've argued that, the Trudeau government, rhetoric aside, has been pretty continentalist to the core economically, and a huge swath of their policy agenda has been directed towards placating the United States. The twist, I think, that distinguishes the Trudeau government or Trudeau-led governments and previous governments has been what I argue has been an interesting branding strategy, right? Going back to the renegotiation of NAFTA. And 6 or 7 years ago, or whenever that was, I was writing about how what was interesting about Trudeau's approach to NAFTA was that it was not arguing outright for deeper integration. It was actually saying that integration was necessary to defend Canadian sovereignty and promote Canadian interests. So this is a huge upheaval of 100 years, 100+ years of Canadian concerns about deeper integration. Now, the twist with Trudeau is that this is our salvation, right? Not, threatening us. And the threat to Canada is separating us or raising barriers to issues. And so, and that was in the context of NAFTA, the NAFTA renegotiations and the first Trump administration. And it continues under Biden, albeit with a very different temperature in the relationship, right? I mean, Biden had his, and I talk about this in the book, his so-called alliance of values, which was about promoting American hegemony globally, right? But in very different terms than the Trump administration. And so we saw ongoing pressures to increase defense spending. We had the Trudeau-Biden roadmap of 2021. We had the critical minerals and mineral security partnership. We had the Energy Transformation Task Force. We had Canada calling for a modernized third country agreement on migration. It wasn't initiated by the US, it was the Canadian government that wanted that. And so that's why I find the current crisis interesting. When Trump gets elected for a second time, again, just like the first time, we see signals from the Liberals that they will play ball. Let's not forget in 2016 that it was Trudeau who offered first to renegotiate NAFTA. Trump didn't say, I want to renegotiate. Trudeau came out the day after and said, okay, let's talk. And again, this year or late last year, we start to see the signals, right? Criticizing China, EV tariffs, immigration crackdowns. Mark Miller saying that not everyone was welcome in Canada, right? And Trudeau saying The Trump administration, this is a quote, is significantly concerned about international pressures, particularly overcapacity by China and unfair trade practices by China. Canada is aligned with the US already, and we're going to be able to do good things together. Right? So there's the signal, right? And it impinges on our ability to address some of the issues that Carolyn raised, as well as issues that Stuart raised. The point is that, America First or MAGA are not uniquely Trumpian phenomena, right? Even though it's easy to label them that way. And the Trudeau government has consistently tried to stay on side of American concerns and demands rather than develop strategies for promoting Canadian interests and addressing the things that my colleagues have raised. The last point here, the irony is what are we fighting for in the current, the last couple of weeks and all the drama? What have we been fighting for? Right? The Trudeau government and others have been using sovereignty and national identity not to protect or promote a uniquely Canadian or distinctly Canadian vision of how the political economy might evolve and transform, but it's to remain in a privileged position inside what Andrew Latham and others have called Fortress America. It's staying inside the empire, right? But we're claiming sovereignty to say, look, don't worry about things. The challenge is that Andrew Latham in particular argues is that Trump is fundamentally questioning the relevance of economic and even security interdependence. So what does that mean for Canadians?
Yeah, exactly. That's actually a question I'd like to put to our panelists. And just to note, we're getting tons of questions from the audience. Excellent. So we're going to definitely keep time towards the end. But I wanted to invite any of our other three panels to respond to the question, like, what is the way forward for a sovereign, independent Canada that can act according to its interests and values in this current circumstance? So any of the three of you are welcome to weigh in with your take on that.
Can I jump in, Amanda?
Let's do. Wonderful.
Because I do think, this has been a question we've had at the CCPA for a long time. And Richard has been doing amazing work on this, just showing that the really long history of some of these conversations we've had from free trade up through the Security and Prosperity Partnership to today, this whole real priority, right, and foreign affairs in Canada has been on good relations with the United States. I think we have to acknowledge that we are in their orbit, right? I mean, there are real limitations, right, to the maneuverability of what you might call lesser countries, right, to hegemonic powers like the United States. So there are clearly limits to what Canada can and can't do without incurring even maybe bigger threats against us than we've seen from the 25% tariff. That said, I think, and again, like Marc said, we've been putting some thinking into this and putting a few pieces on the website about where we might go, right? We've had for a long time in Canada what they call a rip and ship policy with respect to resources. Carleton was getting into this as well. It's like, we don't care who's getting the stuff out of the ground. We don't care who's doing stuff with it. We certainly don't care whether the upgrading of that stuff, that dirt and that oil and gas happens in Canada. Maybe we should be caring more about that. And we can be thinking through how do you ensure that, right? You don't ensure it by a purely market-based approach where companies are free to send it wherever they want, right, for further processing. You have to have some role for government in figuring out how to do those things internally. So, we start coming back to ideas that have been around since the 60s and 70s, right, around having potentially the use of crown corporations, right, to purchase those materials and then to be able to sell them on to other entities in Canada that might want to upgrade them. Or if we're looking to detach and become less reliant on the U.S. market, right, maybe those state-owned enterprises, whether it's for purchasing gas or purchasing critical minerals, can sell them on to other countries who are, much friendlier, right? Who actually want to buy our stuff without constantly threatening our existence, right? Every few months. So that's an idea that we put forward. Another one that's come up a lot, and this is, whether it's Cory Doctorow or other intellectual property experts in the news, they're talking about how many of our ideas are basically patented and then shipped, basically held in the United States and put on a shelf and never really developed, right? Because these U.S. giants in these sectors, the high-tech sectors, AI, pharmaceuticals, and other, they just sit on these things, these developments, and don't develop them because obviously they want to maintain their market position. And so we need to find ways to maybe stop that from happening. We need to not just find national companies that can develop that and help that along, but get to the point where we're actually ensuring that the patents themselves, right, can be canceled potentially, right, and made and put to use in Canada for the purposes of economic development, and especially, and I'm thinking of drugs, for the purposes of producing cheap versions of these expensive brand name drugs. Anyway, these are the kinds of ideas that we can think of reorienting on a national basis in ways that are that don't harm our friends, our friends in the United States and Mexico, but that do a lot of good for us as well.
Thanks, Stu. You mentioned a few ideas that or aspects of what our colleague Marc Lee, senior economist, CCPA based in Vancouver, what you wrote, Marc, in a piece that we published yesterday. You co-wrote it with our colleague Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, and the piece was "A Dozen Radical Responses to Trump's Economic Warfare that go beyond Canadian counter tariffs." So Stu was just talking about some of the ways Canada could respond. Are there other things in your piece that you want to highlight, ways we could respond?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think if we recognize that the United States is essentially breaking up the free trade agreements that we've had with them, starting with the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement and then NAFTA and then the CUSMA renegotiated under Donald Trump, all of those commit us to more aggressive liberalization than we would have if we just fell back to World Trade Organization rules. So in the area of intellectual property, which is kind of a boring topic, I think, for most folks, but this is patents and copyrights, and in particular, I think what Stu's getting at is that we could invoke measures that would allow what's called compulsory licensing for drug producers, meaning that the patent holders would still get a fee for their patent, but they wouldn't be able to use their patent in an abusive monopoly relationship like we've been seeing. So we could actually make that part of a national pharmacare plan. We already have the first ingredients of that brought in by the federal government over recent years. And that would boost our Canadian domestic generic drug producing industry. So it's good for Canadian industry. It hits Americans where it hurts, provides cheaper drugs for Canadian formularies, and helps with our over healthcare plan. So this is like an example of a win-win-win for Canada, simply because we no longer have to abide by the more restrictive agreements that we've made in past trade agreements. But there's a lot of other things we could think about as well. I mean, a lot of the challenge we're seeing with the United States is oligarchs, people like Elon Musk. So these are a very small handful of people, and we know what their assets are and what their economic interests are in Canada. And we can go after those. There's nothing restricting us from doing that anymore. I think similar to Caro, I think it makes sense that we put an export tax on our oil and gas. The fact that it was restricted to a tariff of only 10% instead of 25% in other sectors of the economy reflects the political dynamics within the United States, that there are major refineries in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast who are dedicated to processing heavy Canadian crude. And that's the feedstock that they need. If they don't get it from Canada, they have to get it from Venezuela, which I don't think is a realistic political option in the United States right now. So essentially, by putting that tax on, that will flow through directly into the cost structure of gas prices in the United States, and to actually show Americans what a real 25% tariff feels like, and create some of the internal contradictions that are going to push for a better result in the short term with President Trump.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to go to questions in just a moment, but I just wanted to give an opportunity to our panelists. If anyone wants to respond, I saw Carol nodding her head. Just what the priority is from your perspective for this moment. Carol, did you want to weigh in on that for a moment?
Yeah, I think just, we've talked quite a bit about the importance in this moment of reducing and eliminating in the longer term our dependency on the revenue from U.S. owned oil and gas corporations and these exports that Marc was just talking about. But I think on the flip side of thing, we can use this moment to build and invest in a renewable economy, right? Dictators cannot control the sun and the wind, and so it makes us a lot less vulnerable to these kind of threats. And similarly, when Putin used his natural gas, his so-called natural gas exports to Europe as a tool of economic warfare. So more than ever, I think that is important, and how we do it is key as well. As Stuart was saying, we can also use this moment to divest away from an extractive business model and one towards one where we're focusing on community-led projects that truly benefit people. We know in Canada that Indigenous communities are the largest owners of renewable assets. Let's double down in that as it contributes to sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, in addition to our sovereignty away from foreign countries. The other piece is when it comes to the moving towards 100% renewable electricity. We know that there are significant and appreciated the nuance that Stuart shared in the chat about interprovincial trade and the regulations that come into play here. But being a Quebecer, I think we often hear that it's easier to export hydroelectricity to states in the north of the U.S. and in New England, rather than contributing to decarbonizing the Canadian grid, which is essential, again, to fighting climate change and building an economy where jobs are abundant and lasting. So I wanted to mention that as well on the opportunity side of things, and where the Canadian government should see.
Well, I think Caroline her screen is frozen, but on that optimistic note, just a moment ago, I just want to turn to Richard and give you a chance to weigh in for a moment before we go to our audience questions.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of thinking about moving forward, during the pandemic, my Carleton colleague David Carment and I wrote about how to come out of the pandemic. The IRPP was doing a series on different issues to consider. And one of the things we proposed was a new MacDonald Commission for the 21st century, to have a deep conversation to address things that connect to what we're talking about today. The challenge of a thickened border that we saw in the pandemic that really throws challenges out to Canada. We saw this again during the Freedom Convoy, right? Where when the border is thickened, Canada goes into crisis, and we're seeing this again at this moment. But also we said to rethink the carbon economy that Carolyn and people in the chat have talked about, and to reimagine multilateralism in the context of America First, all in the aim of accepting the end of the special relationship with the U.S. and promoting Canadian interests. And, to me, we're at the same moment that we were in the 1980s when Jim Laxer had his NFB series, The Reckoning, right? And the whole debate about free trade, or, the Science Council versus the Economic Council. we have people like Jim Stanford calling for a new national policy. We have people like David Crane talking about innovation strategy. But we also need to go beyond pure trade and economics, right? In terms of the current political moment, right? The American scholar Gary Gerstley talks about the fall of the neoliberal order. And our strategy is premised on how do we stay involved in the old order, but that order doesn't exist anymore, right? Latham talks about Fortress America. And this is affecting us as well. As Frank Graves has pointed out, authoritarianism or authoritarian populism is present in Canada. And we need to think about going beyond performative strategies to address the real issues, right? The affordability issues and particularly youth and the challenge of youth who are, my students, when I teach my first year Intro to Canadian Studies, have no need for the CBC, have no sense that Canadian identity is under threat, who question why we need Canadian content rules or why do we need the CBC. But it's connected to other issues, right? Andrew Parkin has showed how young Canadians are incredibly dissatisfied, and we see political shifts to the right. Two last things, Ipsos and Abacus have both come out with, as much as we talk about this as a nationalist moment, we also should look at the Ipsos poll that came out last month and Abacus that talked about a high percentage of Canadians who are open to the idea of joining the United States. And two populations or subpopulations of note, young Canadians and supporters of the Conservative Party. So we need to have a big conversation about these issues, right? Because the two aren't separate. To me, they're very, very deeply connected.
Indeed. Well, here we're having a conversation, beginnings of one now. So thanks, Richard. I want to go to an audience question that looks at this is about one of the Canadian solutions that are being discussed at the moment, which is relating to interprovincial trade barriers and what do we do about them, and is dropping them a solution. So this question is, what can be done to reduce trade barriers between provinces, and are there any good sources that can be offered to understand that better, this issue better? This question is really open to all four, any of our four panelists. And so I'll just repeat it one more time. What can be done to reduce trade barriers between provinces? And I might add as a coda, is that how much of a solution could that be for us?
Marc, you want to take this one?
You that too.
Well, why don't I start and then you can finish my sentences too.
Sure.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are some cases where there are some differences in regulations across provinces. So one of the things you see sometimes in the media is that, these differences in trucking regulations are causing big problems. Well, the reason for that, and I can speak as coming from British Columbia, is that we have big mountainous highways here in British Columbia. So the trucking standards that you have in Saskatchewan are not appropriate in British Columbia. So at some level, there's just going to be fundamental differences in those. In a lot of cases, the push we're seeing around interprovincial trade barriers is for much more like deregulation within the Canadian Federation. And that means challenging differences in environmental standards, health and safety standards for workers, consumer protection. So, in some cases, maybe there are areas where we can smooth things out. Obviously, we want to reduce duplication for businesses, but these are generally things that are not bona fide trade barriers. They may add a little bit of costs for businesses to comply with certain paperwork in different provinces, but we're not talking anywhere on the same scale as what we see with Canada-U.S. trade or any other foreign trade. So the idea that eliminating the very few minor barriers to interprovincial trade within Canada is equivalent in any sense to what we're seeing with Canada-U.S. trade is complete and utter nonsense. And I would urge people to think about what it entails crossing the border. You have to go to a customs inspection station. You have to change currencies. You're dealing with a completely different legal and institutional environment. So the idea that like somehow the barriers crossing from Alberta to BC are any way equivalent to between Canada and the United States are completely preposterous. There are a few areas where there are bona fide trade barriers, largely in the area of alcohol trade. And that's another one where you see a lot of the anecdotes popping up. And, you know, maybe there's some justification in doing that. We do have provincial liquor distribution monopolies, which, you know, decide what gets stocked on the shelves. But the idea that I have a wider selection of alcohol products here in Vancouver that come from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, that this is actually going to fundamentally solve the problems of the Federation is complete garbage, in my opinion.
On that definitive note, Marc, Stu, did you want to add anything? Or I've got other questions from audience, but Stu, you said you wanted to say something?
I just want to say, I would just encourage people that when people start talking about interprovincial trade barriers, that we ask what they are. What do you mean? What are the examples? And I think, as Marc said, you'll find the examples are frequently booze or trucking regulations. Trucking regulations are actually being dealt with currently through an existing interprovincial cooperation framework, right? So the provinces are working on this. You know, we make Fruit Loops in Canada, and you can get them anywhere. It's amazing that, right? Like the stuff we produce, you can buy it anywhere. Loblaws, you can find a Loblaws anywhere in Canada. TD Bank operates anywhere in Canada. It's a political agenda, as Marc was saying. But I think it's one we have to grapple with because it's going to factor into the election. It's going to factor in just as these pushes we're seeing at the provincial level for, for faster approval of projects. There is a real link between the interprovincial trade stuff, right, coming from libertarian think tanks and the business lobby groups. There's a link between that and their desire to get more Canadian fossil fuels out of the ground quickly, right? So we have to make these connections and really think it through, I think, because it's going to come up again and again as we head toward a federal election.
And I would add simply that it's a cross-party consensus on this. Anita Anand wrote about this last week, and then yesterday Pierre Poilievre had a video that is really interesting in many ways, saying the same thing, that Canada's biggest trading partner is Canada. And they're proposing the same things that my colleagues are talking about that are really overstated, but also to address Carolyn's concerns are all about promoting pipelines, resource extraction, and so forth. And it doesn't move us forward in any real substantive way.
Right. Thanks, Richard. Okay, I have another question, separate topic, and it is about nationalization. And the question is this: are there industries or sectors of the Canadian economy that should be nationalized in the national interest? If so, which sectors or industries? And that question is open to anybody.
Well, I mean, I'll jump in on that. I mean, I think in the natural resource sectors, there are huge volumes of American investment and ownership. And that's, driving a lot of the trade that we see with the United States. So, coming back to Carol's point that we need to also have, climate objectives and building a green economy in mind, like it may not be possible to get to where we need to get to, things like net zero by 2050, with the current structure of American interests in Canada. So, I think strategies that emphasize, we're calling it repatriation here at CCPA now instead of nationalization. I think it has a better connotation that, these are our resources. And in order to have a managed wind down to a more sustainable economy and the energy transition that we need to make, we need to maybe take steps in that area. certainly other countries around the world already do this. Canada is one of the few places where foreign capital can come in and have a presence in the fossil fuel sectors. Critical minerals, another area where, it's important that, these are strategic reserves and assets that we have, and that, there's a role for Canadian ownership of that. So, none of these are definitive. We need to do more research on what that would look like. But just simply recognizing that there's huge amounts of these industries that are controlled by American companies, more so than any other country in the world in terms of their investments here. Putting that on the table and thinking about what that means in terms of a broader industrial development strategy for Canada.
Great. Mark, anyone, Stu, did you want to weigh in? Or I, of course, have other questions if anyone is not burning to add anything to Mark. No, nobody burning. Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Mark. So I have another question. This is about boycotts. And the question is, what do you make of the call for a boycott? And I just want to underline that there is something called, there's a pledge for Canada that people can sign. There is a link that perhaps we can add in the chat. So what do you make of the call for a boycott?
Amanda, can I say something about that?
Absolutely. And keeping it short just because we're getting close.
That's exactly it. I want to make sure I say something before we run out of time. And the boycott does deal with these senses of patriotism, right? This kind of nationalist zeal that has overcome quite a lot of us in Canada, which is obviously quite natural. I think as a way to put pressure on the Trump administration to get rid of the tariffs, I think absolutely something like a boycott, buying Canadian, not just at an individual level, right? I think people want something to do individually. It makes sense. And obviously buying Canadian is good in any situation. But I think in the big picture, and I'll be quick here, Amanda, is we can't let the nationalism overtake us, right? We have to be building North American alliances on this issue, understanding Trump and what he's doing, understanding the risks to workers in all parts of North America and the world, right? Trump's going to have an incredibly negative effect in terms of relations with Latin America, right? And we can see this already. Do we care about CUSMA or free trade? Not really. I don't think so, right? I don't think we would necessarily worry if that agreement were to be blown up. Let me just decline this call. But there are important pro-labor tools in that agreement as well that should be expanded. And we've been working with North American allies on this, Mexican workers, American workers, and NGOs and others. But how do we balance these ideas in this context, right? How do we cut through the noise, and how do we continue to push for a much more progressive pro-worker vision for the continent in this environment? That is key for me. I don't want to get swept away by the nationalism, but I'm, of course, not going to be buying any more American booze for the foreseeable.
Yeah. Okay. Great point, Stu. And I think that's a good point to end on because we're coming to the end of the hour. I did want to encourage anyone who is listening and wants to support the work that you are hearing these wonderful thinkers and researchers do. This is the work of the CCPA. If you contribute $35 or more a year, you get access to this lovely magazine. I don't know if you guys can see it, but I'm holding up. It's the Monitor, and it comes delivered to your mailbox 4 times a year.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Else. That's the book. There we go. Excellent. Okay, here's the fabulous art. So, okay, we've had so much interest in this webinar. We have more than 500 people joining us at the moment. We had more than 40 questions. We did not obviously get to even a fraction of those, but I do want to extend a hearty thank you to our 4 panelists, Stuart True, CCPA Trade and Investment Research Project Director and researcher, Carleton Brouillette, Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, Richard Nimijean, political scientist at Carleton University, and of course, Marc Lee, Senior Economist with CCPA National Office based in Vancouver. There will be a recording of this webinar sent to everybody who signed up. And you can look on our CCPA website for a piece that will be up there soon this afternoon that gives an overview of the conversation we've had today. And this conversation is just one of many to come. So thanks again to everybody, and I wish you all a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.